Most businesses only focus on growing and expanding, and they give little to no attention to their exit strategies until after exit is staring them in the face. Learn here at Boosting Business Value, brought to you by Blue Sky Business Resources. You'll discover how to shape a more durable and saleable business, and how to implement a powerful, well-planned, and rewarding exit. Join Dr. David Gruder and Jason Tuzinkowicz as they deliver actionable tips for lower middle market company owners, executives, and their trusted advisors. Find out where your business currently stands, how you can meet your revenue objectives more reliably, and how to grow your venture to the next level, all with a smooth and fruitful exit in mind. Here are your hosts, Dr. David and Jason.
Well, welcome back to Boosting Business Value. And in this episode, we're going to explore the burden of leadership and laser in on core key burdens that leaders must develop a lighthearted relationship with in order to lead their business well. And for those of you who are new to this Boosting Business Value podcast, I'm David Gruder, the business lifecycle, exit planning, and post-acquisition psychologist for Blue Sky Business Resources. And with me, as always, is the illustrious and articulate and insightful, ever insightful co-host, Jason Tuzinkowicz, Blue Sky's Chief Operations Officer and all-around ball catcher.
Wow, that's the best intro I've ever received. So thank you, Doc. This is going to be a really meaty episode, and so we're going to dive right in. And the first thing that I'm guessing most of our listeners, as I was when I first heard of this, are asking is, what is the burden of leadership? And as Dr. Gruder and I discussed it, what it really means is in leadership, you are burdened with the responsibility of daring to become who your business needs you to be so that success can happen inside the organization, even though some will likely attack you for this type of leading without becoming tyrannical, maniacal, or narcissistic in the process, making sure that you're up front and in charge, but you're doing it at the behest of the team and the organizational needs.
Yes. And what I'll add about that at the front end is that I have never, ever encountered a leader who says to me that they have never had arrows thrown at them. And that arrow throwing is part of the burden of leadership, developing a relationship with the arrow throwing that we can remain lighthearted about. So what this calls on us to do, if we're going to become who our business needs us to be for it to succeed, then what we have to stay really close to as leaders is a soundbite of mine, which is leaders lead at the level of their unfinished business and their self-development limitations, despite their higher intentions. You want to say anything about that, or does that kind of say it?
I think that you just said a mouthful. You did tongue twisters earlier. Now you're filling our brain with info. So I love it. Let's dig into it further.
Okay. So what we're going to unpack with you first is what we see as being the four biggest burdens of leadership. And I'm just going to say what those four burdens are, and then we're going to discuss each of them one at a time. So the first burden is light holding the light for the company. The second is decision making. The third is cat herding. And if you haven't been exposed to that term, we'll explain it. And the fourth is shadow monitoring. And if you haven't been exposed to the notion of shadow, we'll discuss that as well.
This is great. And, as we talk about a lot in this podcast, once you can name these esoteric things that are weighing you down and you can describe what that name means, it gives you a level of freedom to embrace, capture, and overcome these burdens in a way that you can't when they're just nebulous gray things nagging at your ability to perform at your best. So I love this structure, and I'm excited to get into it. And I'll start with the first one you mentioned, light holding.
Yeah, do it.
And what light holding is really all about is leading with compassion, embodying the culture that you want your organization to have, and upholding core values. It's about building a great team and then facilitating their success. A great leader is not the one who's always got their sleeves rolled up, head down in the trenches. Sometimes you have to do that. But a great leader is also the one who's looking up for opportunities to build a team around them that everyone can bring their best self to the task at hand. And then, the other part of this light holding is the personal example and an integrity. And that's modeling transparency, modeling personal accountability, and embracing personal positive growth, which means sometimes sharing with your team and being vulnerable to the team that, hey, you know what? I really messed that one up. That one's on me. Here's what I learned from it. And here's how we're going to make sure that doesn't happen again. And, all of these pieces of the light holding are the pieces that a leader needs to infuse all of these characteristics, the culture, the core values, the integrity, transparency, and accountability, and good heads up, on a swivel, team building, and delegation. It's the leader that's going to infuse those things into the organization and push it down from the top desk all the way to the frontline staff. Without that light holding, the team doesn't have any guidance to follow.
So well said. And tied in with that light holding that you just described is a leader's relationship with decision making. There are basically, I'll oversimplify this a little bit just for the sake of this being a limited podcast episode duration or length, that there are basically two types of decisions. There are collaborative decisions where a group comes to a decision together, and there are executive decisions where a leader makes the decision on behalf of their team or on behalf of their division or on behalf of their company. And so the burden of decision making is essentially, well, part of it, the burden is knowing when to do which, when to select collaborative decision making around a specific thing that a decision needs to be made about, or to do executive decision making. And if you're doing collaborative decision making, if that's the right match for the decision that needs to be made, then it's crucial that you as the leader assemble the right collaborators and facilitate them well, facilitate them in ways that lead to collaborative decisions rather than gridlock and polarization and divisiveness and siloed thinking and all of that nonsense. And the key to collaborative decision making in a quick nutshell is that what people have generally been trained to do is to take positions, is to say, here's the solution. Here's the decision we should make. Here's the position I have. And that stuff is surface stuff, and it never ends well if the attempt at collaborative decision-making stays at that surface level. What has to be gotten to, and it's our job as leaders to ensure that the team we've assembled to do collaborative decision-making, when that's the appropriate decision-making style to use for a particular decision, we have to be prepared to be able to facilitate the process of looking underneath surface positions and premature solutions to identify everyone's core concerns, deep concerns, and core intentions, their high intentions. Because when you've assembled the right group to do the collaborative decision-making together, and you help the group get everyone's deep concerns and high intentions out on the table related to that decision, you then have a holistic, complete picture out of which you can make a collaborative decision. The group can make a decision that takes into account all of the deep concerns and high intentions that are on the table related to that decision. That kind of facilitation skill is, in my experience, generally not taught in leadership training. And it is a crucial leadership skill along with or inside of the overarching leadership skill with this particular burden, having to do with deciding when a collaborative decision-making process is what's called for and when an executive decision is what's called for. So I'm just going to unpack one last part of this before I turn it back over to you, which has to do with executive decisions. So when that's the appropriate decision-making format that you've selected regarding a specific thing that a decision needs to be made regarding, then what your first step is to do is to get truly diverse input. And when you're collecting input, you don't have to, nor should you ever, take a position. All you're doing is listening. You're making an executive decision. So you're going to decide what portions of the input you get you're going to utilize and what parts you're not going to utilize. You don't have to tell them about that because you're making an executive decision. So in that first step into executive decision making, all you're doing is getting truly diverse input. You're just listening. You're not debating. You're not poking holes. You're not criticizing. You're not judging. You're not supporting either. You're just gathering diverse perspectives regarding the decision or related to that decision. Once you've done that, then you get to discover a decision or a solution that hopefully is one that no one that you've consulted with, none of these diverse sources of input have advocated, that they're unlikely to see, because each of those diverse sources looks at the decision, looks at the situation through their particular lens, their particular temperament, which is great. But because they're looking at it through a particular lens, they're not going to come up with an integrated decision that you're going to be coming up with. So you're going to be discovering a decision or solution that no one else is likely to see, and yet accounts for all of the diverse input that you've gotten. And I refer to that as the wisdom of James T. Kirk. For those of you who are Star Trek buffs, this is a Star Trek reference, but if you're not a Star Trek buff, don't worry, because I'm going to describe this in ways that make sense regardless of whether Star Trek is or isn't your thing. The way that the captain of the original Enterprise in Starship in Star Trek made decisions is that he consulted 2 or 3 of his top leaders. He consulted his chief science officer, who was his second in command. For those of you who are Trekkies, that was Spock. He consulted his chief medical officer for the people side of things. That was Dr. McCoy, Bones. And he oftentimes also consulted his chief engineer, Scotty. And each of those 3 people had vastly different perspectives on the issue at hand that he needed to make an executive decision about. And every time he would come up with a solution that none of the 3 of them suggested, and yet that incorporated grains of, or kernels of, or pebbles or boulders of each of their perspectives. And that to me is high level executive decision making. Did I articulate that okay, Jason, before I go on to the last part of executive decision making?
Yeah, I think even for those of us who don't watch Star Trek, we get it. It's you did a great job. Thank you.
Awesome. And then once we've made our executive decision, our job is to communicate it well and to allow expressions of discomfort. So I'll touch on the communicate it well part, and then I'll talk about allowing expressions of discomfort. So in communicating it well, what is necessary is you're never justifying a decision as a leader, but you are illuminating your decisions as a leader. So this is not about justifying. It's first of all about disclosing what your concerns and intentions are related to the decision, even before you say what the decision was. Just conveying, here are the concerns and intentions that I have and that I heard from the people that I consulted with before coming to this decision. The second is for you to provide rationale. So you describe your process of arriving at a decision that honors the concerns and intentions that you've described, in addition to the decision aligning with your company's vision, mission, and values and guiding principles. So you lay that out. You don't leave it to the people you're communicating this decision to figure that out for you. That's your burden as a leader. It's on your shoulders to convey that rationale. And again, rationale is illumination. It is not justification. And with that rationale comes the decision that you've arrived at. And then you are going to adopt a compassionate stance as you listen to people's reactions. You're not likely to change your mind. That might happen based on people's reactions. I'm making up numbers here, but like 1 out of 10 times. What I'm trying to convey there is that you might change your decision based on new information you get when you're listening to people's reactions, a very small fraction of the time that you've made an executive decision. It still might happen sometimes, but mostly not. Your job after you've illuminated the need, the concerns and the intentions and your rationale and the decision you arrived at is to just maintain compassion as you listen to and honor the discomfort that some of the people you're expressing your executive decision to have. And if you maintain that kind of lightheartedness and compassion, whatever arrows come at you because of the decision you've made will just slide off your back. You're not going to get poisoned. You're not going to get hit by the arrows that come your way from some of the people who have their own authority issues, and we'll get into that later, where they feel like they need to attack people in authority. So you're conveying what the need was, your rationale for the decision and what the decision was, and then you are not rebutting people's concerns or discomfort. You're just showing up for their discomfort so that people know you have received them, you've heard them, and that you are sticking to your decision, again, except in those unusual situations where you actually hear crucial information you didn't hear while you were doing information gathering that might occasionally cause you to change your executive decision.
Brilliant. And I just want to piggyback on this decision-making thing, because I mean, the vast majority of what great leaders do is make decisions, right? And so, one thing that is required in order for that communication and compassion piece to really work for you is to remember that you are not your decision. And when somebody doesn't like the decision that you've made, it doesn't mean they don't like you. And so that's an important piece to keep in mind. And then the other piece where you started.
I'm glad you added that. Go to the other piece.
Thank you. And the other piece where Dr. Gruder started with all of this was know when to do which. We've all had the leader that loves to make executive decisions unless they know that the decision that has to be made is going to make people unhappy. And then they want to collaborate. That is not the right use case. One of the things to consider in executive decision-making is time. If time is of the essence, then it's almost always going to have to be an executive decision because collaboration takes a lot more time. The other piece is in collaboration, if the executive doesn't have the capacity to gain full perspective, full understanding, and the diversity and scope of the decision that's being made, that's the most common appropriate time to bring in experts and stakeholders from other places so that the decision-making body can have full perspective and understanding of not only the decision, but the consequences of the decision that's going to be made. And then the only other time that I think collaborative decision-making is requisite, now there are other times where it can be helpful, but when it's requisite is when there are key stakeholders that need to have a sense of ownership of the decision before they'll be able to champion it. And so those are kind of some real simple, straightforward guideposts for, is this an executive decision or should I collaborate? So I just kind of wanted to jump in on those things.
And I'll do one quick piggyback on that because that's so spot on. The fundamental principle that you're illuminating with your last comment is that if the people who are responsible for implementing a policy or a procedure haven't had some level of involvement in crafting it or inputting into it, they will not implement it. They will not adhere to it.
Yep. And that can be, you can still make executive decisions that fit that case as long as you're communicating effectively. You're listening well when you're gathering input, and you're communicating your decision well when you're passing it on. But you have to have as you're thinking about, is this my decision or is this our decision? Thinking about capacity to achieve the expectations of successful decision-making is a big part of determining how and with which mechanism do we make that decision. So all of that said, we spent a lot of time on decision-making, but this is a big deal. This is 98% plus of a leader's job. So it's worth spending some time on. But let's move on to burden number 3, which you eloquently named cat herding, and I love cat herding. It's one of my favorite things to do. But
Mine
we see
too.
it. We see it in every organization, and it's important. But cat herding isn't what it sounds like in effective leadership. It's not just chasing these feral creatures around and hoping you can get them where you want them to go, but usually not. Cat herding is about, 3 different things. And the first one is being the collaboration thermostat. And what that means is paying attention to the temperament in the individuals and the organization. If they're running inappropriately hot, whether that's anger, whether that's enthusiasm that causes them to get over their skis, or whether it's something else, if they're running inappropriately hot, then as a leader, you got to cool them down. You got to bring them back to focus, get them back in balance. And when they're insufficiently engaged, when they're cooling off on a project or they're cooling off on the vision of the business, that's when you heat them up. You get them reason to re-engage and give them that emotional incentive to take pride and ownership of the organization and the projects at hand again. And then once you manage temperature, then you got to make sure that you're breaking down barriers, you're avoiding silos, and you're making sure that your organization is a platform as a whole, not a cellular structure where there are walls and divisions between each of the parts. And then, monitoring. We talked in the light bearing about leading by example, about driving the core values and the personal growth and all of those things down. But in this cat herding piece, you're actually looking at best practices and frontline processes and making sure that we're always asking. We talked about Kaizen in a different podcast, but always asking, how do we improve? How do we move the needle? What needs to be updated? And making sure that the team is updating best practice always, and implementation and process and all of those things. So from that comes personnel development. As you're upgrading your process, as you're improving best practice, as you're raising the bar in quality for your organization, it's important to do the exact same thing for your staff. make sure that as you're innovating, growing, and diversifying, that you're bringing your team along. You don't make your team obsolete through your raising of standards, expectations, and technical know-how. You're bringing your team along so that they're always the experts in what you do as an organization, and paying specific attention to not just developing skills, but developing mindsets, developing good habits, and elevating the alignment of your team behind your organizational vision. And then there's the part we all love to talk about within cat herding, which is dealing with those egos and those challenging individuals. And I have empathy because I am a challenging individual. I like to break things. I like to ask why. I like to challenge the status quo. And so, when I had actual jobs as an employee, I was deemed tedious by many of my managers. I was well-meaning, I was well-intentioned, I was committed to the work that we were doing, but I was always trying to break things so that we could build them better. That's a challenging, difficult person in your team. Then you've got the contrarians, you've got the people that just like to cause trouble or will never be satisfied with their work, with their job, with the team around them. And as a leader, you've got to figure out which one's which. And you've got to learn how to mitigate the challenging impacts, bring out their best self in the workplace, or invite them to practice their talents someplace they might be happier. And this piece of leadership takes a lot more time than any of us want to spend on this. It takes a lot more energy to do well than most of the things that you will do as a leader, because the energy is twice as burdensome, because it's not only hard effort, but it's hard ego work at the same time. You're being beat up as you're trying to lift up. And so this is doubly hard work, and it's the work we don't like to do. But turning a difficult team member into a leading asset is very powerful for the organizations. And when I was that difficult person and I was empowered to, okay, go try it out, make some changes, I got stronger and our team got stronger around us, because there was this positive energy. There was this Kaizen, moving forward and improvement. And so when you can turn a challenging team member into an asset, they're going to be among your most powerful assets. And when you can't, then you've got the other opportunity of kindly, graciously, and generously helping them recognize, hey, you know what? We're not fitting well together. You're not happy. We're not happy in your unhappy presence. Maybe it's time for you to practice your talents elsewhere. Can I make a couple recommendations of organizations I think you would fit well in? There is a generous and a gracious way to let challenging people go away without giving them a sharp boot in the keister. I'm still a fan of the boot, but but good leaders do it in a compassionate and graceful way. And everybody is a bad person when they're in the wrong environment. And so this isn't a judgment about the person as an individual. This is a wrong fit situation. And if you keep that in mind, it's a lot easier to be compassionate and supportive in inviting them to go away.
The thing that I'll add briefly to that is that I have often seen people labeled as difficult people who actually aren't difficult people. There isn't a culture mismatch. There aren't the things going on that should cause a leader to, in a good way that you described so well, disengage the person from the company. Sometimes what's called a difficult person is actually someone who's got a very different perspective or temperament from your own as a leader, and you may not recognize it. And I'm going to do one very quick example of that. which is matchers versus mismatchers. So some people by temperament, they look for the common threads. They look for the common themes among things that various people are saying. And then mismatchers are the ones who will always find the fly in the ointment, what's missing, what's being neglected, what's a problem area that isn't being discussed or sufficiently addressed, or risk factor that's not being sufficiently addressed. And of course, we have all known people who are that type of mismatcher, but who do that in really abrasive ways. That's simply because they don't recognize they're a mismatcher and they don't feel like their mismatching temperament, which is incredibly valuable to have on a team, is welcome on the team. So that's an example of potentially a person who gets labeled as a difficult person who actually isn't a difficult person. We're the difficult person because we don't understand the gold they bring to the team and how to draw out that gold in constructive ways.
Beautiful. I love it.
So let's move into the final burden of leadership that we're touching on in this meaty episode, very meaty episode, and that is shadow monitoring. So what shadow is things about us individually and collectively that we repress, deny, ignore, or unjustifiably justify. We're aware that they're there and they're not helpful, but we justify them anyway. And so there are a number of different types of shadow that need to be monitored in an organization. And I'll just quickly say what they are, and then I'll say just a small amount about each type, because what I'm about to cover is a 5-minute encapsulation of a 2-day training program. The first are about individual shadow in us as leaders or in our personnel. The second is co-created group shadow. The third is culture shadow. And the fourth is institutional shadow. So in the individual shadow dimension of shadow monitoring, we break it down into our own shadow and the shadow of those who are on our team. Leader shadow is largely around us not having a good, comfortable relationship with being in power, being in authority, having authority designated to us. And so some leaders abdicate their leadership. They just try to be likable. They try to be agreeable. That's abdication of leadership. That's a version of authority shadow. Another is a leader who is denial of the gaps, about the gaps that they have in their leadership skills. And the fact that leaders have gaps is never a problem. Denying the gaps is where the big problem is, because if we're denying the gaps we have, we can't ever make decisions about which of those gaps we want to fill, we want to expand our skill set with, and which of our gaps we're going to have other people on our team manage for us, handle for us. So gaps denial is a huge leader authority shadow issue. And the last is something we have all seen, unfortunately, is tyranny, where a leader is power drunk, and that's misuse of authority and power. Follower authority shadow, the authority shadow that you'll see in your team, is it takes a number of different forms. One form is where you've got people who are constantly deferring to people who are the decision makers or who are in the authority or power or leadership role. They don't speak up. And when they don't speak up, leaders don't get crucial information they needed to have in order to make good executive decisions. So if you've got somebody who's doing self-sovereignty abdication, they're giving up their voice. They're not speaking up when they have something important to contribute to your knowledge so that you can lead and make decisions well. You've got another form of follower authority shadow is the overt arrow throwers, the people who are constantly attacking people who are in authority or power positions because they have unresolved wounds around power abuse that they've sustained in prior jobs or in their family growing up or in their religious affiliations or wherever. I mean, that power abuse can happen anywhere. It's not just in our own original families. Sometimes it's not there. It's elsewhere, like a power drunk teacher who did a lot of abuse, verbal abuse. So people come by their arrow throwing honestly, and arrow throwing should never be tolerated, but it should never be attacked back either, because arrow throwers come by their arrow throwing for really good reasons that deserve compassion, not indulgence, not tolerance, but they do deserve compassion. And then you get the people who are in covert rebellion, where they'll rebel behind the scenes, behind your back. And then you have people who do covert undermining, where they're throwing arrows, but you never really know that the arrows are being thrown at you because they're recruiting other people against you behind your back. Which is a little different from rebelling. This is active undermining. Then you've got group co-created shadow. And the most common version of group co-created shadow is something that I refer to as the projection magnet dynamic. And I can explain this very, very simply. In a conflict situation, you will have certain people who have decided so-and-so is the problem, and if only they got their act together, we'd all be fine. So they throw arrows at that person. And oftentimes it's a person in power that, or it could be a difficult employee too. That will happen too, where that's who the arrows are thrown at. But you have the arrow throwers, you have the ones who are having the arrows thrown at them, and then you have everyone else who's doing one form or another of collusion, where they're either trying to jump in to be the hero when nobody is asking for a hero, or they're trying to be the peacemaker when nobody has designated them the peacemaker, or they are going and gossiping at the water cooler about all these negative, bad things that are going on, but where they're actually sticking their head in the sand because they're not really doing anything about it. Or where you've got triangulators, you've got people who go to someone else. I have the problem. I go to Jason. I tell Jason about the problem that I don't have with Jason. I have with a third party. And I go to Jason to tell them about the problem, not so that I can get input from him about how I can handle that problem with that person in a better way. But instead, I go to Jason to try to recruit him to do my dirty work for me and confront that third party for me. So
I feel like you've seen me as the weakest link here.
Right. And the thing about the magnets, the ones who receive the arrows, and the arrow throwers and the colluders, is all of them self-identify as victims. Every one of those groups identify themselves as victims, innocent victims. So learning how to recognize when a projection magnet dynamic is in operation and how to intervene in a good way with that is a really important leadership skill that rarely gets taught. And then leaders wonder why their culture is going to HE double hockey sticks in a handbasket. And then the final two forms of shadow, culture shadow, is where it comes up a lot with diversity training, DEI training. And it's where you've got diversity initiatives in your company that some people are resisting, or you have diversity initiatives that are being misused to either reinforce guilt on the part of those who have privilege, who have power, who have the ability to get stuff done or be heard or things like that, or where it's being misused in order to reinforce victim thinking on behalf of target groups, of groups that are more disenfranchised and don't have as much power. So that's culture shadow, and it takes both of those shadow forms where the initiatives are either resisted or the initiatives are misused. And then institutional shadow is where you don't have enough diversity in perspectives or temperaments on your leadership team or on your work team, or where you've got institutional shadow because the institution, the entire organization has an attitude of when a blind spot is pointed out, it's just cast aside. We're impervious to input. We're impervious to blind spots being pointed out. Or where there's a punitive attitude about whistleblowing, whistle calling, or where you've got a culture that is coercion oriented or compromise oriented rather than collaboration oriented. So those are the different forms of shadow that leaders have to be aware of, monitor, and know how to intervene with effectively, or designate someone who will do that on their behalf.
Brilliant. Prior to this conversation, I hadn't heard of shadow monitoring, but it makes a ton of sense. I really appreciate the way you broke that down.
You're welcome.
So
A
let's
lot of
bring it
people
home.
haven't, and it breaks my heart because it is shadow that kills organizations. It's the stuff we deny, repress, or indulge, even though it's not good. That's the stuff that kills organizations.
Yeah, nothing good happens in the dark.
Yep.
I love it. So all right, let's get positive here. How do we have success and solve these burdens, or at least learn how to live lightly with them?
Yes. Well, there are 4 areas we're going to touch on briefly: envisioning, embodying, facilitating, and feeding. So envisioning is where we, as the leader, it's on our shoulders to continually hold the vision, the mission, the values, and the guiding principles for decision making, to voice those consistently rather than assume that in a particular situation everybody's remembering those things. So voicing them and reminding people about those. That's the envisioning responsibility that we have. If we do envisioning, that lifts the burden because we won't feel alone in holding that vision and mission and values and guiding principles. We're just reminders. We're not the police.
Perfect. Yeah, and the next one is embodiment. It's realizing that leadership it's a responsibility. It's not an award. And really becoming who the organization needs in order to facilitate success within the organization. It's not just carrying the light, but it's shining the light into all the dark corners. It's having the hard conversations. It's being a mentor. It's making good decisions and knowing how good decisions are made and communicating. Embodiment is the responsibility of being the heart, the beating heart and the thinking mind of the organization, so that you can put blood and sensory and knowledge throughout the whole body.
Well said. So the third of the success roadmap dimensions is facilitation. This, again, is another thing that in a lot of leadership programs, it's not taught. Leaders are taught to lead, and the notion that a leader is a facilitator or a midwife or a catalyst is not talked about often enough, let alone the skill sets for effective facilitation being trained, being offered to leaders. So the image that I'll use around facilitation is a musical one, because I'm a recovering musician who, among other things, was trained in conducting. And so imagine that you've got an ensemble of extraordinary instrumentalists, people who are really good in their musical instrument. And they need to be helped to make beautiful music together. So in order for there to be a high performing ensemble, you have to have really talented people playing the instruments. But as a leader, the facilitator capacity of a leader is where we're helping them make extraordinarily beautiful music together. We're facilitating, using the music metaphor. There are times when a particular instrument needs to be being played louder in a particular section of the music or softer in a particular section of the music. That's not an insult to the instrumentalist. It's about being the steward of the overall product so that all the instruments are heard and they're the right volume in relationship to each other. So you're the conductor. Your job is to become a superb conductor of a brilliant ensemble of instrumentalists.
That's wonderful. I love it. And the last one is feeding. And obviously feeding is one of my favorite things to do. But feeding in the organization is promoting growth for the individual, the team, and the infrastructure of the organization. It's providing a positive perspective, but having a whole perspective to share and encouraging people to own the organization with you, to bring out new exciting opportunities for growth, for improvement, for expansion. If you're feeding your organization, it's going to grow in many ways. And one of the ways is that everybody will have that ownership and help you in this quest to promote growth, optimization, and diversification. So with that, we've done it. We've gotten through the challenges. We got through the success roadmap. Let's talk about some key takeaways. And with all of this information that we've thrown out and discussed, what are the most important things for our listeners to kind of latch onto, the little mustard seed that we can plant in their brains to let it grow as they go through their leadership journey?
True, because this has barely been a fire hose episode, hasn't it?
It has. It's been a lot. And for me, the biggest thing is the understanding that leadership is a burden. It's a responsibility, not a privilege. And it needs to be treated in that way. And as leaders, we have to determine how do we thrive? How do we energize? And how do we bring vibrancy to an organization when we're burdened with this responsibility? And it all has to do with coming into a lighthearted or a symbiotic relationship with understanding and executing on these burdens.
Yes, really, really well said. And then the other key takeaway is that, to tie this back to something that I said toward the top of this episode, I really hope that now that we've unpacked all of this, that you're now seeing what I meant when I said that leaders lead at the level of their baggage, their unfinished business, and their self-development limitations, despite their higher intentions. So the takeaway from that is without shame or blame toward yourself, because a lot of leadership programs, in my judgment, most of them have all kinds of gaps and holes in them, so it's not your fault. Just simply recognize which burdens that we've covered are your self-development growth edges and get training and mentorship with those.
Perfect. I love it. Well, on behalf of Dr. Gruder and myself, thank you so much for going on this journey with us. I hope that that you took away some pieces that will help you be a better leader. I hope you had fun with us. We had fun doing it. And, we'd really love to ask you to subscribe. If you like what you heard, we're doing a lot more of this type of thinking. And so please subscribe, please comment. If you've got thoughts, if you've got an issue that you're struggling with in your workplace, or a question that you just really like to, hear us work through, please send us some comments. You can do that right at our webpage. We've got all the podcasts on the podcast tab at blueskyadvisors.net. And while you're at blueskyadvisors.net, we also have a series of free tools for business owners to get some report cards on how their strategic planning infrastructure and how their organizational infrastructure stack up, and some real-time, right away feedback on what you could be doing to strengthen those things. So please make use of the tool. It's free. It's insightful. And
it's not just free. Don't be fooled by free. These are way, 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 way better than free.
Perfect. And you'll see what he's talking about when you get into it. But yeah, please subscribe, comment, take advantage of the tools that we have provided for you. And, you're also welcome to just be in touch. So with that, we thank you so much, and we'll talk to you again in the next episode.
That's all for this episode of Boosting Business Value. May your new learning result in the smoothest and most profitable exit strategy for your business. With the right knowledge and guidance, the sky's the limit to what you can do. Do not miss an episode by subscribing to the show. And if you want to learn where your business currently stands, we also have free key opportunity assessments. Find all of them at blueskyadvisors.net/podcast. Thank you for joining us. See you on the next one.